So I'd like to say hello to everyone, and I'm Arran Stibbe, and I guess we will be starting in a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to say that I'm here and we'll be starting very soon. Okay, so is everything okay at your end? Would you like me to start my presentation?
Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Arran.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Please just wait for 5 minutes. Our secretary is about to join in another 2 minutes.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much.
We'll go by the agenda. மேம் இங்க ஒரு 25 பேர்கிட்ட ரெக்வஸ்ட் வர்றது இது பண்ணலாம்னு சொல்லியிருக்காங்க. A warm afternoon. Literature is one of the most interesting and significant expressions of humanity, and to have another language is to possess a second soul. On behalf of PG and Research Department of English of Srimad Andavan Arts and Science College, Autonomous Trichy, the Sun and I are pleased to extend a genial welcome to the first session on Introduction to Ecolinguistics of the 3-day international webinar on language and literature, jointly organized by the Departments of English, Tamil, and Sanskrit. May I request our respected Secretary and Correspondent, Sri Ammangi V. Balaji, to deliver the inaugural address.
presentation is on Ecolinguistics. So
May I request our respected Secretary and Correspondent Sri Ammangi V. Balaji to deliver the inaugural address.
Good afternoon, one and all. Got connected to network here, and I'm extremely sorry for this network problem which has delayed the program by 15 to 20 minutes. It's indeed a great honor to be before you on this first webinar session being conducted by the language departments together. This is the first webinar session that's happening when our college is entering into the silver jubilee year. Our college is getting into 25th year, and this is the first webinar that's being conducted by the 3 language departments. Andavan Arts and Science College believes in upliftment through empowerment and empowerment through enrichment. We believe and we practice that empowerment can be achieved only through enrichment. And it is indeed a nice occasion that the first session coincides with enrichment. The topic goes language and literature. It's indeed a nice occasion where mother tongue, commercial tongue and cultural tongue are going to join together. And this is the occasion when the world is totally fragmented by way of various issues. The only connecting link is language and literature. The webinar starts with parental approach. Languages and literatures are the parents of any stream. Literature, be it in English or Sanskrit or Tamil, it covers everything, be it management, be it science, be it research, be it medicine. Everything is covered under in literature in any form. It's often said human being is the only creature which has sixth sense. The sixth sense is being sharpened by language and literature. Language and literature makes the man perfect. So it's all the more befitting that the webinar starts with the language departments. I thank you one and all for having given this opportunity, and I'm happy to welcome our speakers who are going to enrich you for the next 3 days in English, Tamil and Sanskrit. With these few words, I welcome you all for this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. May I invite Dr. M Jayachandran, Coordinator, Assistant Professor of English, to welcome the gathering and to introduce the chief guest.
I request all the participants to keep their mic on mute mode. I request all the participants to keep their mic on mute mode till you get into the discussion session. Carry on, Jayachandran, carry on.
Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of Department of English, Srimad Andavan Arts and Science College, I would like to welcome you all to this international webinar on language and literature. This webinar is being presented in an optimal situation. The knowledge of ecological linguistics is the need of the hour, as we have started to live a new normal life. The expert of the day is an expert of Ecolinguistics. Dr. Arran Stibbe is a professor of Ecological Linguistics, University of Gloucestshire, England. He is the founder and convener of Ecolinguistics Association. He has done his PhD in Ecolinguistics at Lancaster University. His research focuses on linguistics, human ecology, and speech and natural language processing. And he has received a National Teaching Fellow Award and Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy Award. A warm welcome to Professor Arran. I welcome all the participants who are from various parts of the world. Thank you.
Hello. I just want to check if you can hear me okay. Yeah, and everything seems to be quiet.
Thank you, sir. The session is over to Dr. Arran.
Great. So should I start?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. So I would really like to thank you very much for inviting me to give a talk today. I've been doing ecolinguistics for about 15 years now, and I started the International Ecolinguistics Association, and it had about 5 members in it when I started, and now it's got about 800 members right across the world, and it's been a great pleasure for me to see ecolinguistics spreading right across the world. And I'm very pleased with how many people are joining us today in India. And I think India is a very important voice in ecolinguistics for the reasons that I'm going to give in a moment. So I'm going to start my PowerPoint presentation. Could you just bear with me for a moment while I get it ready? Okay, so if this is working right, you should be able to see my first slide, Ecolinguistics, a search for new stories to live by. Could someone just confirm that you can see that okay? Can you see the screen okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Well, let me begin then. So I thought I would begin in India with Eastereen Kaya, a fabulous author, and she won the Hindu Prize. And she's from the Angami ethnic group, which is in Nagaland in northeast India. And her writing draws on Naga legends. So she's an amazing writer who draws on traditional Naga legends and weaves them into her books to present them to the new generations. So this is her book, The Son of the Thundercloud. And I'm just going to give you a quote from this book. So when I first came to live here, the earth was green and fertile. There were storytellers who went all over the land telling stories to the people and spreading joy and hope. But when the storytellers were killed, one after another, people slowly forgot what they had been told and allowed their minds to accept the darkness. So the drought came as a result of people rejecting the joyful stories and accepting the dark stories. So I love this, and this particular quote really sums up what eco-criticism is about. So I'm going to talk about eco-criticism and ecolinguistics, but both of them are about stories and the dark stories that are destroying the world, but also these stories of hope and joy. So the dark stories are stories of consumerism, of greed, of competition, stories which see nature as a resource to be exploited, stories of inequality, or stories which see humans as separate and better than other species and nature. And these are the stories that are destroying our world. And we need to move to new stories, stories of community and care and sharing, and seeing nature as having value, as being sacred, as being unique, as being special, as being worthy of protection, seeing humans as part of nature, and this idea that we should be more rather than have more. So this book, The Son of the Thundercloud, it's organized around a hero's journey. So Pele leaves his home due to a terrible drought and famine, and he goes on his great adventure. And there's a theme that runs through this book, and the theme is about water. So there was initially a terrible drought, but then there were rains, and there was enormous ecological restoration when it rained. So all of the forests and the trees and the plants came back when it started to rain. And there's a river in this book called the Mother, because this river provides food for people. And then there's a terrible rainstorm later, which ruins the houses and the fields. And of course, the son of the thundercloud himself was born from a raindrop. So you have this theme of water that runs through the book. And the book links water with fertility, with human flourishing, with climate change, and with culture. And I'd say there's one key message from this book. And the message is that when traditional culture is ignored and people are greedy or filled with hate, ecological disaster will occur. So this is what Eastern Kaya is trying to do, is she's trying to draw on traditional Indian legends, stories, ways of speaking about the world, and put them in her books for the next generation so that they can reinvent society on very different lines, according to very different stories. So this is eco-criticism that I'm going to mention first, and then I'll get on to ecolinguistics in a moment. So this is a quote from Glotfelty about eco-criticism. So all ecological criticism shares the fundamental premise that human culture is connected to the physical world, affecting it and affected by it. Eco-criticism takes as its subject the interconnections between nature and culture, specifically cultural artifacts. So cultural artifacts, things like books, primarily, but also things like films or statues or gardens. I would say cultural artifacts are things created by humans in some way to be beautiful or to enrich the culture or to convey a deep message of some kind. So most eco-critical work shares a common motivation, the troubling awareness that we have reached the age of environmental limits, a time when the consequences of human actions are damaging the planet's basic life support systems. Now, ecolinguistics is a little bit different from eco-criticism, but the two share something very strongly in common. So ecolinguistics explores the role of language in the life-sustaining interactions of humans, other species, and the physical environment. The aim is to show how linguistics can be used to address key ecological issues, from climate change and biodiversity loss to environmental justice. So this quotation's from the International Ecolinguistics Association. So ecolinguistics is interested in cultural artifacts. It's interested in books and films and statues and gardens, but it's also interested in everyday texts, texts which you wouldn't really think of as cultural in any way. So we might be interested in environmental textbooks, in economics textbooks, in newspapers, in weather forecasts, in lifestyle magazines, in recipe books, or just general everyday conversation. So that's one thing about ecolinguistics, is that it's interested in all kinds of texts, whether they are literary or cultural, or whether they are everyday kinds of texts. So I've done this little diagram, and you can get the slides later if you want to look at this in more detail. But yeah, so the eco-criticism, the focus is on the complete cultural artifacts. So it might be about a complete book or a complete film, commenting on how those artifacts inspire people to protect the environment. So it's interested in the books themselves. Now, ecolinguistics is more interested in the language patterns that exist within a whole range of books or a whole range of films. So, for example, we might be interested in the language patterns of the weather forecasts and how they represent human connection with nature. So the language patterns are what is important in ecolinguistics. But both eco-criticism and ecolinguistics analyze language, analyze images, and other kinds of texts. And they both are interested in relationships of humans with other species and the environment. And I always call those life-sustaining relationships, because these are the relationships which keep humans alive. They sustain human life and the life of all the other species on the planet. And they're not just academic forms of study, they have a practical side. So they both actively work to protect the ecosystems that life depends on. So I'm going to start with an example, and this is an example of an ecolinguistic analysis. So this is something which happened when diesel car sales in the UK fell. So they didn't sell as many diesel cars. And so ecolinguistics, we could analyze the language of the newspapers and how they reported this fact that diesel car sales went down. So of course, ecologically, this is great because diesel cars are terribly polluting. But the newspapers didn't represent this in a positive way. In fact, they represent it in a very negative way. So if you look at the newspapers, you can see a pattern of negative words used to describe this. Things like slumping, dragged down, declined, dropped, blamed, disappointing, plummeted, frustration, consternation. And this is a pattern that goes right across all newspapers. When the sales of anything, no matter how environmentally destructive it is, when the sales go down, that is represented as something bad, something negative. And we can do a linguistic analysis of this. We can look for appraisal patterns, which are patterns of words which represent something negatively. There's obvious ones like disappointing, but there's also a lot of subtle linguistic ways that things are represented negatively. Ecolinguistics can analyze these language patterns across a lot of newspapers and point out that this is a problem. We shouldn't be talking about diesel cars going down as something bad, because 38,000 people a year die early because of diesel emissions. So we can point this out, and we can try to tell newspapers just to stop representing things like this as bad when actually they're good. So this is how we would analyze it. So we've got a particular pattern of language, and behind that pattern of language, we've got a story. So in ecolinguistics, we use the word story in a different way from how it's used in eco-criticism. So stories are mental models in the minds of people, which influence how they think, how they talk, and how they act. So you have this pattern of language, and behind it is this story that low retail sales are bad. And this is a story in the minds of individual people, but it's also a story that is spread right across the culture. So it's a story in the minds of multiple people across a culture. And for that, we say it's a story we live by. This idea that if we're not selling enough stuff, then something bad is happening. And of course, this has an impact on the world because it encourages us to buy more stuff And when we buy more stuff, we damage the ecosystems that life depends on. So we have these dark stories of industrial civilization that are spreading around the world, these stories of consumerism, greed, and competition. So we'll have a look at some more of these dark stories from industrial civilization. Because we have the pandemic now, and everything has changed. And a lot of people are saying that we should return to normal. But normal were these dark stories of industrial civilization that were leading us towards disaster. We can't return to normal because then human beings will not have much time left on this planet. So there are voices out there who are saying we can't just return to normal. This one in the Rush to Return to Normal uses time to consider which parts of normal are worth rushing back to. And here's a great quote from Sonia Renee Taylor. So, we will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than we normalized greed, inequality, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. These are the dark stories that I'm talking about. We're being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature. So these are the new stories, the bright stories of joy and hope that we need to find as we emerge from the pandemic. Here we have another expression from Arundhati Roy. So historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. Really, this is the best time in history for doing ecolinguistics or for doing eco-criticism, because we have to reinvent our world along very different lines. So I'm going to continue with some dark stories that you can see in newspapers and other kinds of texts. So this is a story about immigration that we see in the UK. And I've had a look at some headlines which represent people who come to the UK. So have a look at these. So Turkish President Erdogan repeats threat to flood Europe with refugees. So these are newspaper headlines representing refugees. Huge hike in the number of migrants flooding the UK. A tidal wave of poor European migrants heading to Britain. Fears of new migrant influx. So moment migrants storm the Kent beaches. You can see you've got a water metaphor here, but it's not a positive metaphor like Easter in Kaya's metaphor of water. This is a very negative metaphor of representing people coming to the UK as a dangerous flood, and that, you know, that we're going to be overwhelmed by these people and they're going to damage and hurt the country. Now, this is a very negative story that immigrants are unwelcome. And it's negative for a couple of reasons. Well, it's negative because, you know, people who come to this country help and make the country a better place. And it's negative because a lot of these people are coming to the UK because of environmental destruction in the places where they come from. So we've got this story, and it's a narrative. So narratives are a sequence of events in a logical order. So we've got this narrative of immigrants flooding the UK, and they're taking British people's jobs, and they take welfare money, and they commit crimes, and they have this terrible effect on the country. But this narrative, it erases certain things. So it erases where the migrants came from, why they left, and the exploitation and ecological destruction which caused them to leave. It erases who's responsible for that ecological destruction, which of course is the rich industrial countries like the UK. And it erases the positive contribution that refugees and migrants make when they come and settle in the UK. So this is a kind of very negative story that ecolinguistics would want to criticize and critique and really get in touch with newspapers and say, this is a very negative story which is very damaging to people and to the environment. But we should also look for positive stories. So occasionally there are positive stories representing refugees in the press. So this is from the Sun newspaper, which has always had this really negative way of viewing refugees. And they published this article. And the article is, "My brave mum risked everything flying across the world to save the NHS, that's our national health system, and inspired our coronavirus hit. You clap for me now." So you clap for me now. This is a video, and the video presents the voices of doctors, nurses, teachers, professionals who have come from other countries. And I won't show you the video now, but I'll give you a quote from the video. So this is how the video starts. It says, "So it's finally happened, that thing you were afraid of. Something's come from overseas and taken your jobs, made it unsafe to walk the streets, kept you trapped at home. A dirty disease. You clap for me now, you cheer as I toil, bringing food to your family, bringing food from your soil, propping up your hospitals, not some foreign invader, delivery driver, teacher, lifesaver. Don't say go home." So this is a really positive use of language to tell a very different story from the story, the narrative that appears so often in the newspapers. So it's quite interesting how this story starts. It starts with, "So it's finally happened, that thing you were afraid of, something's come from overseas and taken your jobs." So that is the narrative about these people coming from other countries and stealing jobs. But then you get to a dirty disease. So it's not the people who has come in and stolen the jobs. It is coronavirus that has come in. And then they emphasize this great contribution that people who come to the UK make to our hospitals, to our schools, to our farms. So this is a very positive story. So this is the kind of story you want to celebrate and promote. So jumping to something very different, okay? So this is a very deep story in industrial cultures. It's a story that you can find in economics textbooks. So just about all the major economics textbooks start with neoclassical economics. And there's this assumption built into this language of economics that humans are fundamentally selfish. So I've analyzed a lot of economics textbooks, and here are some quotes from them. "More is better than less. Consumers always prefer more of any good to less. Consumers are never satisfied. More is always better. People want more than they can have." So this idea that we're all selfish, this is a very negative story, because we're not actually selfish. But we're made selfish because of advertisements. So this is an example of an advertisement. And it's an advertisement for a sofa, and it says "room for living, not just a living room." And this advertisement, it shows us something which would actually make us happy, which is spending warm, nice time with our family. But it's kind of pretending that to get that happiness, you need to buy an enormous sofa. I mean, that wouldn't even fit in my house. So these advertisements turn us into the greedy consumers that the economics models predict, because we're all searching for happiness. And these advertisements say, well, you can get your happiness from buying our product. So we end up creating a society based on selfishness. Now, Michael Halliday critiques this idea of economic growth, this story of industrial civilization, that economic growth is the goal of society. So he looked at newspapers, like I did, and he found when they talk about air travel, They always talk about how wonderful air travel is, and things like a more optimistic outlook includes prolonged air travel expansion driven by continued growth. So whenever newspapers talk about an increase in air travel, it's always something that is represented very positively. So Halliday says, everything here and in countless texts repeated daily all around the world contains a simple message. Growth is good, many is better than few, more is better than less, big is better than small, grow is better than shrink, and up is better than down. Gross national products must go up. Standards of living must rise, productivity must increase, but we know that these things can't happen. We're using up the fresh water in the agricultural soils that we can't live without. We're destroying many of the other species. And so he's saying that this pattern of language is encouraging us to destroy the world. And we have to find new patterns of language which don't represent economic growth as the goal of society. So I think India is a good place to look for other patterns of language. So we have Vandana Shiva, and she says economic growth hides the poverty it creates through the destruction of nature. A living forest doesn't contribute to growth, but when trees are cut down and sold as timber, we have growth. Healthy societies and communities do not contribute to growth, but disease creates growth through, for example, the sale of patented medicine. Water doesn't create growth, but when Coca-Cola sets up a plant, mines the water and fills plastic bottles with it, the economy grows. Vandana Shiva is a fantastic commentator, and so she presents the idea of sharing as an alternative to growth. That we don't need more and more of things, that we need to share things with each other. And she draws very much on traditional Indian cultures, where community is valued far more than profits and accumulating piles of possessions. So the words of Vandana Shiva is one place to look for inspiring ways of using language that can help create a new form of society. Okay, so a completely different area of life. So this is the pork industry. Pork industry uses very negative metaphors. So here's one: the breeding sow should be thought of as and treated as a valuable piece of machinery whose function is to pump out baby pigs like a sausage machine. Okay, so this is a very negative way of talking about pigs, and it's quite an old example, but it's such a strong one that I like to use it. So this is, of course, a metaphor, and it's a metaphor that erases pigs as beings who have a mental life, as animals who live for their own purposes and who can suffer. So because of this kind of metaphor, you can create a factory farming system that's immensely cruel and environmentally destructive. So these are the dark stories that we need to move away from. And you might think that the discourse of ecology would be much better, but often ecology is represented in economic terms. So this is an example from an ecology book. The structural elements of an ecosystem are stocks of biotic and abiotic resources, which when combined together generate ecosystem functions or services. So this is a kind of language which erases plants, animals, forests, rivers, trees. It doesn't represent them as having any kind of value except as stocks of resources. So this is another kind of language that we need to move away from. And that's because, this quote from Leo Alderpold, we can be ethical only in relation to something that we can see, feel, understand, love, or otherwise have faith in. So we need to search for forms of language that can represent nature in ways that we can see, notice, and care about the natural world. So one example of this that I've looked at in some detail is the discourse of haiku. So haiku are traditional Japanese poems, and they are of 3 lines, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5 syllables when they're in the original Japanese. And they represent a unique encounter of the poet with some aspect of nature. So this is an example. Furuekiya, kawazu tobikomu, mizu no oto. An old pond, a frog leaps in, sound of the water. It's a very simple poem, and you might say, well, it's just mundane, it's not interesting at all. But that's the whole point of it. It represents an ordinary pond, an ordinary frog, as something special that we should notice and care about. So I've rewritten this using the language of ecosystems and ecology. So an old ecosystem service provider, a biotic component leaps in, sound of the aquatic resource. So it kind of loses something when you put it in the language of ecology. So I've analysed haiku in great detail. I'll just very quickly go through some of the features of haiku that help you to notice and appreciate the ordinary nature around you. So one of them is sonomama. Sonomama is appreciation of things for what they are. So the patrina, a very ordinary kind of flower that you'll see by the side of the road, the stems as they are, the flowers as they are. So this expresses appreciation for this flower. It doesn't say they're wonderful or fantastic or anything like that, but it doesn't need to, because haiku always expresses appreciation for the natural. And the plants and animals that appear in haiku, they're all ordinary ones that you would see around you in everyday life. So we've got butterflies and cuckoos and dogs and skylarks and sparrows. And there's no lions or tigers or zebras or animals like that that you wouldn't see in nature around you. And they do what they normally do. So a bat flies along the rows of green willows, falling from a tree, the snake slithers. So representing animals doing normal things. They're not doing something special like putting on clothes or walking or talking or the kind of things you would see them doing in a Disney film. Sometimes humans are represented as interfering with nature in some way, but that's always represented with regret. So whispering something to the rose, she cuts the rose. Some kind of regret for cutting the rose. This is my favorite one. I regret picking and not picking violets. And it shows some identity with nature. So cherry blossoms, residents of this world too, a short time. So this word too is more in Japanese. So this represents cherry blossoms and humans as being identical along the plane of having short lives. And what's important is that haiku show care. So this is what you need. You need words and language that makes us notice the natural world and care about it. Washed hair in the same sunlight, a bee is dead. And there's no doubt that this is a tragedy, that it is very sad that the bee has died. And these are a couple of my favorite ones, and this is about simplicity. So haiku represent meeting your needs through being in nature. In my hut this spring, there is nothing. There is everything. In my hermitage, all that I need, wind in the pines. So this is the idea that once we have our clothes, our food, our shelter, we can then find everything else that we need through our contact with other people, through appreciating nature around us. And we don't need to have a huge pile of consumer goods. This is a very positive form of language that can help to establish the new stories that we need to really emerge from this pandemic and rebuild a simpler, kinder kind of society. So one last thing that I'm going to talk about is identities. So these are stories about what it means to be a particular kind of person. And I've had a look at Men's Health magazine and the kind of language that appears in the magazine. Now, Ecolinguistics is always interested in patterns. So you can see across the covers, there's a pattern of a single male being represented with enormous muscles facing the camera, looking out at you, telling the reader that they too could have enormous muscles if they bought the magazine and followed its advice. And if you look at the front cover, then there are a lot of expressions like build big arms, build 6 kilograms of hard muscle, muscle doubled. It's really encouraging men to focus on having a huge body. They might think, well, what's that got to do with ecology and environment? Well, the problem is that they're encouraged to eat an enormous amount of meat in order to get those muscles. I eat a lot of meat. I'm not boasting. I need the protein for muscular growth. I eat animal protein at every meal. So I'm not boasting presupposes that eating a lot of meat is something to be proud of. Or the sweet science of beefing up. Steak is a reliable weapon in the battle to bulk up with protein and creatine, arming your muscular growth when training. So there we've got meat and we've got arming, which is kind of a military metaphor. So this is really encouraging men to eat a lot of meat. And meat, of course, is very ecologically damaging. So we've got these stories that the ideal man has huge muscles and the ideal man eats a lot of meat. That encourages men to eat lots of meat, which destroys the environment. And then we've got things like this. Use explosive power like a Norman knight. So Norman knights used the high protein content of their meat to build the explosive power required for successful Saxon smashing. Yeah, that's one's quite hard to say. Successful Saxon smashing. So these are ways of using language that encourage men to be violent and to link meat with violence as well. So when you look at the magazine and the patterns of language in the magazine in general, they encourage men to work out on their own to gain power, status, muscle, performance, encourages them to buy big, powerful cars, and it encourages them to buy lots of fashion clothes as well, all of the sports clothing. So it's just encouraging men to be consumers and to consume a lot of meat and products and spend all their effort on their own muscle and power. It never encourages them to take part in actions which benefit the world. Never encourages them to volunteer, to help people, to grow vegetables, to bond with their family, to spend time in nature. All the things which would actually be really good for their health and make them happy. And so finally, I'll just say something about ecological identities. So ecological identities is where humans are considered to be part of a group, which includes non-human. So it's a group, and some of the members of the group are human, but some are animals, or some are plants, or some are forests. So you can actually use language in ways that include humans into the natural world. So this is an example. So we abuse land because we regard it as a commodity. When we see land as a commodity to which we belong, when we see land as a community to which we belong, we may be able to use it with love and respect. So this is a reframing. So we tend to see land as a commodity, as a resource. But here, although Leopold is representing the land as a community that we are part of, so it's humans and the land community includes the animals and the plants and the forests and the rivers, and we're all one community. This is an ecological identity that he's creating. And just one more example of this. So this is from Esther Wolfenson, and she rescued a pigeon, and she saved this pigeon. And she says, together, in spite of our obvious differences, we were as bound as any two creatures on earth by something only too measurable, life itself. And what's so nice about this is she's using this pronoun we, and we includes her and the pigeon as one unit of we. And then it talks about life. that we share something in common. We both have life. So this is representing humans and more than humans together as one group, as part of the we, sharing something in common. So I will conclude there. The ecolinguistics is a form of analysis which reveals the stories that underlie texts and opens them up for question and challenge. It can be used to raise awareness of the dominant stories we lived by before coronavirus and can be critical of ones which didn't serve us well. Most importantly, it can help us in the search for new stories to live by. So for me, ecolinguistics is extremely important as we emerge from the pandemic and we look for new ways of living. And those new ways of living have to be ecological. They have to be sustainable if we're going to have a future. So I'm just going to stop there and return to the main screen.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Arran. And we have a question from our side.
Great, thank you. So I'm back. Can you see me?
Yes, you're visible. Okay. What could be the first step in becoming an ecolinguist and learning the techniques of ecolinguistics? Can you explain us about your online course, The Stories We Live By?
Yeah, I would love to tell you about this. So I created an online course. It's a completely free online course. And the course takes you through 9 different types of story that we live by. So it takes you through ideologies, framing, metaphors, erasure, salience, identities. And I've just touched on those very briefly in my presentation. But each week there is a video, there's PowerPoints, there's notes and exercises. And you can work through the course in your own pace. And everyone is welcome to join. And what's nice is when you finish the course, you can have a free certificate from the International Ecolinguistics Association to say that you've finished the course. And it will give you practical skills in ecolinguistic analysis. So to find it, just type Stories We Live By into Google. But I'll make sure that we send a link out to everyone. And everyone here is welcome to take the course. And it's completely free.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Arran. And we have one more question. Can you explain how does man's quest for economic growth destroy nature? And what is the role of language in advocating economic growth and accumulation of wealth?
Yes, I'd be happy. So the reason why economic growth destroys nature is because you're creating the goal of society as more money changing hands. So that's all that economic growth is. It's a measure of money changing hands. Now, there's some ways that money changes hands that don't destroy the environment. So something like massage. So if I pay someone to give me a massage, then that doesn't destroy the environment. So there is some scope for some economic growth in things like massage or childcare or growing vegetables. You know, there's some scope for economic growth that doesn't destroy the environment. But the problem is that most economic growth is centered around products. There's only so much that you can buy from other people, you know, without, in the end, something physical changing hands. So to get economic growth, you have to get people spending more and more money. So you have to advertise vast amounts of stuff to them. So economic growth is associated with ecological destruction simply because it encourages people to buy more and more things. The language which promotes economic growth, well, it's in all of the economics textbooks. that economic growth is uncritically talked about as something positive and as the goal of society. And it's talked that way in news reports. So, for example, the British Broadcasting Corporation is supposed to be independent and balanced, but they always represent economic growth as something that is good. And they never kind of balance it with an environmentalist saying, well, actually, what we don't need is more economic growth. What we need is more equality. So the alternative to economic growth is redistribution of resources. So you have a steady state economy, things stay as they are, but you redistribute resources so that everyone has enough to meet their needs. Does that answer the question?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Arran. And we have one more question. Okay, is climate change a problem? As an eco-linguist, how do you see it?
Climate change.
Yes.
Now, this is very interesting. Okay, because if you say climate change is a problem, then you're framing it in a particular way. So what are problems? Problems are things which have solutions. When you have a solution, then the problem disappears. And that's how we often talk about climate change, that it is a problem and we need to just find some kind of solution to it. So often people talk about electric cars or they talk about alternative energy. And when it becomes pretty obvious that that's not enough, then they talk about geoengineering the planet to fix climate change. So is it climate change a problem? Well, it's certainly something that is right now having a very negative effect on the planet and is inevitably going to continue having a negative effect, and that negative effect is going to get worse. So it's not a problem in the sense that there is some kind of magic bullet or solution that will make it go away. And some people see it as a predicament. So a predicament is something that is happening, it is negative, it's not going to be solved, but we have to respond to it in some way. So predicaments have a response. So what can we do about climate change? Well, we can massively reduce consumption and emission of CO2 so that it doesn't get much worse. And we can, we can also prepare for the inevitable impact of climate change, so adaptation. So creating societies that are more resilient and people look after each other in the society and they grow vegetables and just create the kind of society that is more stable in the face of climate change. So that's just quite an interesting point about, is it a problem or is it a predicament?
Okay, thank you. And we have one more question from our participant, Dr. Shanmugapriya. And can you explain how ecolinguistics can help for the second language acquisition and how the words we use turn to be unhelpful for other species?
That's such a good question. I'm really glad you asked that, because this is something that I often talk about. So second language acquisition, shall we talk about India and talk about TESOL in India, so teaching English as a second language in India. So with TESOL or TEFL, what tends to happen is that the teacher will use a textbook that was written in America or it was written in the UK. And that textbook will be full of consumerist messages. So I've even analyzed environmental textbooks, and they still have messages about shopping and about cars. And this is because traditionally, teaching English as a foreign language has been used by places like America or the UK to increase consumerism in places like India and encourage people in India to buy our products. Now, this is very unfair because in India you have many traditional cultures, as I started off this talk with, that have deep ecological wisdom in them. So for me, the purpose of TESOL, or teaching English as a foreign language in India, is to help people to discover the legends, the stories, the ways of using language in their traditional culture, and then express those in English so that they can spread around the world. So instead of stories coming from America and the UK encouraging India to become more consumerist, then it should be the other way around. And teaching English as a foreign language empowers people in India to spread, deep ideas from traditional cultures in India across the world, as Easter in Kaya does, as Vandana Shiva does. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One more last question, Dr. Arran, from our participant and who is watching YouTube live. And is ecofeminism is also a part of ecolinguistics? This question is from Ekta Lada.
Yeah, absolutely. So, although I couldn't go into much detail, ecolinguistics always analyzes texts within a philosophical framework. So we have to judge whether texts are positive or negative. And we judge whether texts are positive or negative according to our ecological philosophy. And there's many places we can draw our ecological philosophy from, but ecofeminism is a particularly important philosophy for us to draw from when we're judging whether language is positive or negative. So Vandana Shiva is a prominent ecofeminist herself. And ecofeminism, if people are not familiar with it, looks at the source of ecological problems as lying in the domination of men over women. So it's the same domination of men over women as it is of humans over nature. To solve the issues, we have to solve the inequality in our society first, and we have to create a gender equal society, a society that respects women and respects nature together. And there's various texts that we can analyze that are incredibly positive in spreading an ecofeminist message. So I would say that ecofeminism is one of the philosophies that you can draw from when you're doing ecolinguistics. And I personally think it is a really useful and valuable philosophy to draw from.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Arran.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed giving the talk to you today. And I hope that people will join the online course and we'll go through that and get in touch if you're interested in ecolinguistics. So thanks very much for inviting me.
And it's time to propose vote of thanks. Gratitude lays the foundation for the success of any event, be it small or large. I am indeed privileged to have this opportunity to propose the vote of thanks. The role of our respected Secretary, Sri Ammangi V. Balaji, in inspiring and motivating us towards planning and executing this international webinar is significant. I express my sincere gratitude to our Secretary and the management for being pivotal in the grand success of all our academic endeavors. Thank you, sir. I also thank our Director, Dr. N. Ramanujam, our beloved Principal, Dr. J. Rathika, and our Vice Principal, Dr. M. Pichaimani, for their untiring support and motivation. Thank you all. I extend my sincere thanks to our Dean of Arts, Dr. R.P. Rajeshwari, for being our source of strength and for her valuable guidance. Thank you, ma'am. I deem it a great pleasure in expressing our gratitude to Dr. Arran Stibbe, Professor of Ecological Linguistics, University of Gloucestshire, England, for readily accepting our invitation and being an excellent and right resource person for this session. Thank you so much, sir. And Dr. Arran, you are such an epitome of humility, and thank you. I also thank our coordinator, Dr. M Jayachandran, and my colleagues for sharing the responsibility shoulder to shoulder to conduct this webinar. Thank you all. Our technical team played a major role in flawlessly conducting this seminar, and I thank our technical supporter, Mr. Srinath, and all the team members, and Dr. Sugashini for their efficient service. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. I extend my sincere thanks to the fraternity of participants from various countries like Iran, Iraq, Oman, Yemen, Nigeria, Singapore, and Philippines, and all the states of India for their active participation. Thank you all. Last but not least, I thank God Almighty for bringing us all together today and to get enlightened. Thank you. And the second session will be started by 3:30, and please bear with us if there are any glitches, and hope we'll meet there. And the feedback link will be posted after the second session. Thank you all. We'll meet at the second session. Thank you.